For a whole lot of people, 2020 was a really tough year. A lot of good folks lost their job, some lost their minds too, I guess, and we all had trouble getting our hands on the stuff we needed. Well, the same was true for a lot of bad people too, myself included. As a functioning opioid addict at the time of the pandemic, supply chain issues and general anxiety made it much harder than usual to get a clean fix. It also made it way harder for me to make money since the restaurant I worked at was closed for weeks at a time. My stimulus check didn't last long, and then after a few weeks of burning through my emergency fund, I was starting to get a little worried. Not only that, but the number of dealers going temporarily offline for the lockdowns was getting higher and higher, which in turn drove up the price of everything. I needed a money-making scheme and fast, so I tried all kinds of things, including setting up a .onion domain. Now, a .onion domain is basically a website on the dark web. Now, I can hear all you nerds howling, "Actually," already, but that's basically what it is, and to be honest, it was a little more than a joke to start with. Now, I wanted to learn how to set up a tour site anyways, so what I uploaded ended up just being somewhere between a joke and a Hail Mary, and I worked pretty hard on it, and when it went live, I felt pretty damned proud of it. And then plastered at the top of the page was the site's title and concept, Dirty Deeds Done Dirt Cheap, or 5D for short. Now, it was a reference to one of my all-time favorite AC/DC songs, and I figured it was the perfect way to sell a very specific set of services to the people of East Texas and Western Louisiana. Now, see, I might have been a scumbag drug addict, but I was also something of an adrenaline junkie, too. I wasn't out to walk old ladies' dogs or help people move apartments. I wanted to do something exciting, something to liven up lockdown, so I offered people a chance to get revenge. Whether it was a bitter ex or some a-hole boss, I was offering to pull a mean prank on them for a prearranged price. Clients paid half before the job and half after, on pain of their victim finding out exactly who paid for the prank to be pulled. I didn't think it would get much traction. I mean, it's not like it was a surface layer website that'd show up on Google if I paid them a few bucks a month. A person needed a Tor browser to get access to 5D, and normies don't use Tor. But then one day, I checked the site's email address on a total whim and was surprised to find a job request in its inbox. Now, the message was from an anonymous user, as they all were, who said their ex-boyfriend was an abusive a-hole who needed to be taken down a peg. Now, I offered to shove a bunch of sardines into the vent of his car and explained how they'd be stinking to high heaven after just a day or two in the summer heat. Now, she thought that was a good idea, transferred me half that Bitcoin, and then that night, I drove over to the address that I'd been given where I did the dirty deed. Now, I then took photographic evidence and then received the second half of the payment once I'd driven back home. Now, the girl seemed real happy with the end result, and so she was only too happy to pay. And then when I told her to recommend me to a friend, she actually did, and I got my second job just a couple of days later. Those first two jobs were the only ones that I had for like 3 months, but when the second stay-at-home order was issued by Greg Abbott, I guess more and more people decided to screw around on the dark web, but slowly and surely, business started to pick up. Now, I smeared a bunch of dog crap on some guy's front door handle, apparently because he stiffed a client out of overtime pay. I then plastered this lady's house in a bologna mosaic because the acid in cheap bologna etches clear coat in the sun and ruins a paint job. And I was told that she gave a kid a bad grade for some petty personal reason, but I didn't care, as long as the Bitcoin arrived in my wallet. Now, I even rolled a bunch of glitter onto a driveway, and sprayed a bunch of herbicide onto a lawn so it spelled out a curse word, and I once painted a house with pure fish emulsion at night. It seeps into whatever it touches and makes a place smell like low tide mixed with death for like 6 weeks. And as you can tell, I became something of an artist when it came to pulling especially mean pranks. And then with all the photographic evidence that I was uploading to the site, visitors were able to see how serious and effective I was, and that generated a lot of business. Things started fairly light, shall we say, with my mainstay being mean revenge pranks. But then as time went on, the job started to get a little more sinister. And one time a user asked me to take a package from a deserted pickup point to a deserted dead drop, and I knew it was probably drugs or something, maybe a hot pistol wrapped up tight in a t-shirt and taped up. But the price was right, and so the job was done. And I used to get similar or identical jobs maybe once or twice a week too, so those were my big earners for a while. But then came stuff that really started to push my limit. One time I was instructed to pick up a thumb drive from this dead drop, and then I had to take it to some dude over in Kilgore who either put something on it or copied something from it before taking it back to the dead drop. I don't know what the heck was on that thumb drive, and neither do I want to, but from the look of the dude that I dealt with, whatever it was very, very nasty. And that was the first time that I got home from a job and figured that I should probably be a little bit more choosy when it came to the jobs I took. I wasn't even desperate for cash by then either, because the restaurant had opened again and I was getting shifts. Now, I wasn't going to do it for money anymore. I was kind of just doing it for kicks. I did a few more jobs, nothing too sinister, but I was really starting to notice the change in clientele. I was getting fewer and fewer jobs that could be described as harmless pranks, and more that, like those others, made me feel sick to my stomach once they were over and done with. I'd already decided to close this site when that last request came in, but as you'll soon see, I had no choice but to entertain it when I saw how much money they were talking. And so by this stage, I was checking 5D's email only once or twice a week instead of every day. I was mostly just skimming the emails, turning my nose up to all the weirder requests that were most likely way more illegal than just making someone's car smell like anchovies. But then, I saw this one request, one which promised me way more money than I'd ever been paid before. I charged a couple of $100 for more basic jobs, a couple of $1,000 for much more complex or costly ones like the fish one, but this one was offering me $10,000 for a single night's work. Now, I emailed them back, saying if the job involved physically hurting anyone, I wasn't interested, and they replied saying that I wouldn't have to hurt anyone, but that the job might require coercion and possibly some physical force too. But for $10,000, I was more than willing to get a little handsy with someone if I could guarantee a clean getaway. And only then did I ask what they needed, and only then did they drop the bombshell on me. They wanted me to kidnap someone. Now obviously I had questions, and the first one was, who? Now I wasn't expecting the answer they gave me, and not because of the name they gave me either, very much the opposite. You see, they didn't give me a name. They just told me, anybody. And once they told me the job was to kidnap literally any female, preferably an adult, but a child would do, I was thinking, no way, dude. This is either a prank or a fed. But then they lost me altogether by claiming that they were part of some big, shadowy organization that liked to partake in, of all things, live cannibalism. That's not just regular old cannibalism either, people. Like the kind that kept the Donner Party going. Live cannibalism involves amputating parts of your victim while they're still alive, and then cooking and consuming said parts while the victim is forced to watch. I called the guy out, told him I didn't believe a word of that, and said that he wouldn't be hearing from me again. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is when they sent me their X-Pub. Now, without getting too technical, if you put someone's X-Pub, Y-Pub, or Z-Pub into an extended public address in a blockchain explorer, you see their total crypto balance for any given wallet. It's not a particularly smart thing to show a stranger because you can see this person's transaction history too, not just the amount of crypto they've accrued. But this is how I realized this guy wasn't some bullcrapper, and wasn't some edgy 15-year-old doing it for the lols. The guy had $500,000 worth of Bitcoin, and his transaction history showed evidence of major traffic. He was 100% legit. Bitcoin was moving in and out of that wallet every single day, and some of the transactions were way higher than just 10K. It was probably the strongest evidence this guy could have possibly presented to me to prove that he was legitimate, and so as you can imagine, I was pretty stunned. But I wasn't horrified. Not yet. Just because the guy had a ton of Bitcoin at hand didn't mean it wasn't a prank. But instead of dismissing my concerns, this guy made every effort to address them. They wouldn't give me any details regarding their organization, only that they existed. But on the off chance any of the girls' remains were found and a murder investigation was opened, they also didn't want anyone who'd freak out and go to the cops. They wanted someone who could live with themselves, having sold a human life for just a few $1,000s, and I guess they figured that person was me. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. As I ended up talking to this anonymous and apparently very wealthy user from around 11 at night to 3:30 in the morning, talking methods, techniques, and logistics. They had a drop-off location lined up and claimed that they could guarantee the site's security, but they also offered help in planning the actual kidnap and offered me a bunch of advice on how to coerce, intimidate, and overpower my potential victim. I actually typed out a bunch of it, but it's probably not very YouTube-friendly to be talking about that kind of stuff in videos. Specific stuff, I mean, so I'll just skip over the particulars of what I was told. But needless to say, it was detailed, it was extensive, and it was disturbing, and to me, it was yet more proof that this person was not just some prankster with a dark sense of humor. They were for real. I suppose now's a good time to make it clear that I had no intention whatsoever of actually going through with the job. As in, from the moment the word kidnap appeared on screen, I was out. And then after a certain point, every single question I asked and every piece of information I extracted was purely for the benefit of law enforcement. I didn't even confirm the job with the client, I just confirmed my interest and said that I'd get back to him within 24 hours. But not even 2 hours of those had passed before I had taken 5D offline. I was exhausted afterwards and I desperately needed to get to sleep, but I couldn't, and instead, I headed out to a payphone while it was still dark. I used a text-to-speech program on my phone to relay everything I'd been told to a police dispatcher, including the address of the drop-off point, which I'm assuming was the most useful to them, seeing as someone's name had to be tied to the deed. Now, what kept me awake, what pushed me to report what had happened rather than the 8 hours of sleep I needed, was something the anonymous user had said after I told them I wasn't interested. They told me it was 5 figures for one night's work, that it was worth my time and I wouldn't get caught if I only did it right. But once again, I just said not interested. In response, the guy then says, and this isn't verbatim, but I'll summarize, "If you won't do it, we'll find someone who will." Now, this was before I'd seen the guy's Bitcoin wallet, so the words didn't land as intended until after I'd seen it, but once I had, it changed everything. I mean, I still wasn't 100% sure that what had happened was for real, because you can never really be sure of strangers you meet online until you truly know them. But although I was creeped out enough to report it, I wasn't convinced that I'd heard anything about it, as like any sort of arrests or trials or anything of that nature. But then one day, I did. So this was in September, and I was just sort of mindlessly scrolling when I spotted a headline about a guy from Texas. And seeing as it was local news, the headline grabbed my attention right away, but what I read made my jaw drop. A man had just been convicted of soliciting murder and cannibalism on the internet, and his name was Alex Barter. Long story short, Barter ended up talking to an undercover cop online, and from what I read, he gave them pretty much the same speech that I'd been given by the anonymous user. The undercover cop was offered cash to procure a kidnap victim, and just like in my case, the person was open and honest about the fate awaiting the victim. And there was nothing in any of the articles about the Bitcoin wallet that I'd seen, and there was also minor deviations in what the cop appeared to have been told. But while it all sounded very familiar, seeing a picture of Barter was confusing to say the least. If you Google image search this guy's picture, you'll agree that I'm being very generous when I say that he hardly looks like a criminal mastermind. He was only 23 when he was convicted, and he was apparently acting alone. But Barter was first arrested in 2018, and it just took till 2020 to sentence him. So if that was the case, then who the heck had I been talking to if Barter had been acting alone? And that's what makes me think that there really is some kind of network of people out there. Maybe they're not quite the criminal geniuses they like to think they are, but they've got money, and by the looks of things, they've got people too. Maybe they're better described as fall guys or pawns if you're feeling fancy, but they got people out there doing the legwork for them to keep the rich guys' hands from getting dirty. And I think I encountered one of them, and to this day, it scares the crap out of me how people like that exist. There will be more of them too, and just like they told me, it's only a matter of time before they find someone willing to work with them. And that little factoid is something that still keeps me up at night, even all these years later. My name is Max, and I grew up in Germany, and for as long as I have lived, I have tried to live a good life. I obeyed my mother and father, and I worked hard in school and university, and then I ambitiously and meticulously prepared myself for a career at one of Germany's most elite manufacturing companies. I was ambitious, aggressively so, and I can't deny that, but I was never arrogant and always remained ethical and humble in all my dealings with others. I donated a portion of my salary to charity and even a portion of my time to a local deaf charity. And while I admit to doing this to bolster my own self of well-being, that came part and parcel with living a life of good works and community service. But it was still not enough to keep me out of trouble. By the age of 32 in 2010, I hadn't been involved in any sort of violent altercation since a schoolyard shoving match during a game of football. And I lived a simple, happy life, having married in 2008, and by 2010, we had decided to start trying for a baby. It was a happy and exciting period in my life, probably the happiest and most exciting I'd ever known, but it was exhausting too. I'm not trying to make a crude joke, I just simply mean that my wife and I began planning like crazy, picking out design plans and furniture for our upcoming nursery. Now, it was a lot to think about, and I ended up losing more than a few hours of sleep over it. But it wasn't just the prospect of becoming a first-time father that was keeping me up, because I'd also put my name in for a promotion at work. A position had opened up following the resignation of a colleague. It was essentially an assistant director's role for my division of the office, so while I wouldn't be in charge, I'd have dominion over my former coworkers. And almost everyone put their name forward for the role, and I was open with my colleagues about doing the same. Everyone wished each other luck, and I believed everyone had the attitude of let the best man win. But as I came to learn, that was not entirely the case. I remember the day that a colleague in another department gave me the good news. We had all interviewed for the position, but management had not yet decided who the best candidate had been, and so we were all still waiting to hear back from them when an old friend of mine pulled me aside. He was dating one of the bigwig secretaries, this girl named Clara who had access to the executive lounge, and it was there that she had heard a member of management explaining how strongly I'd interviewed and how I'd entered a final pool of just 4 potential candidates. And as you can imagine, this was fantastic news which made me very happy, and I rode that wave of excitement all day long. But when it came time to finish work and head home, I remember feeling the exhaustion starting to get to me. By the time I climbed into my car seat and slid the keys into the ignition, I actually considered napping for a little bit of an hour so I had the energy to drive home, but I decided against it. Then, and only then, did I fasten my seatbelt and check my rear view to see if anyone was behind me. And if I'd chosen to do so any later, I might presently be dead, because when I looked up, occupying one portion of my rear view was a masked man. I believed him to be a car thief or a carjacker, I suppose you might say, so I quickly locked my doors and turned on my engine, intent on driving away. And yet the moment I turned the key, I heard the first shot. My windshield shattered along with the back windows, and I instinctively lowered myself down in my seat. If I hadn't, I'd be dead right now, as a police officer told me one of the bullets traveled directly through the headrest where my skull had just been moments before. I was able to drive quite easily, but I was so panicked that I almost crashed into the adjacent row of cars as I turned out of the parking lot and into the open corridor. I don't know exactly when the gunman stopped shooting. I was too focused on my escape, so I didn't slide up in my seat and resume a regular driving position until I was out on the street again, and fleeing as fast as my car would travel. I'm not sure exactly how long I drove for, but I did so very quickly. It occurred to me that I might get pulled over by the police, but I decided I didn't care. It would save me waiting for them in the parking lot of the fast food restaurant, which is where I ended up calling them from after nearly getting into several accidents while driving. The police officer was there within just a few minutes, and after explaining what had happened to her, she calmly offered me a ride to the police station so I could give a longer and much more detailed statement. My car wasn't roadworthy anymore, so I was given a ride back home where I explained to my very tearful wife that someone had just tried to murder me for no apparent reason whatsoever. It was a terrible time for both of us, but for weeks I believed that I had been almost the victim of a very aggressive carjacker and nothing more. But I was wrong. The police found the man who tried to shoot me, and at first I was amazed. I had a lot of faith in the federal police force, but the speed at which they apprehended the man was impressive nonetheless. Once again, I expected his motive to either be greed or addiction, as in he wanted my vehicle. But while greed was indeed a factor, it was not my vehicle that the man wanted. He wanted my life. And after the police tracked him down and arrested him, the man chose to cooperate in exchange for a more lenient sentence, and what he told the police was truly shocking to me. He'd been hired to kill me after discovering that there was a bounty on my head, and he discovered this on a sort of invisible website accessible to only certain people who knew how to find it. The investigator used the English language term dark web when I spoke to him, but the significance of this was lost on me for quite some time until I heard about other people being targeted in similar contract killings. The man confessed to having been hired by an anonymous source and had no idea why they wanted me dead. But what he did say was that the man who hired him seemed to have a very intimate knowledge of my work schedule along with where I parked my car. And this is how we came to learn that it was probably one of my coworkers that had paid him for my death. But despite everyone in my department being questioned, as well as company executives, no arrests were made and no definitive evidence was ever found. Now, I wasn't surprised. The prognosis had been bleak from the beginning. If someone knew how to hire a hitman on that dark web, even if it was an incompetent one, they most likely had the wherewithal to delete any evidence of the exchange from their computers. And this meant that, even after their digital devices were analyzed, police were no closer to finding the person who tried to have me killed. Naturally, a huge part of me wanted to depart the company and find work elsewhere. I couldn't possibly work alongside anyone I suspected of wanting me dead, and that's what I told the executives. It was a bitter irony to find out that I'd secured a job that I didn't even want anymore. But in the end, I was made an offer I couldn't refuse. Now, I was offered an inflated salary, extra benefits, and I was promised the company parking lot would be reinforced and manned by security from then on. I was also offered a considerable one-time payment as well as legal aid from the company's lawyers to keep the story out of the media as the executives didn't want any bad press. Now, if I was a single man, I might have refused on principle, but since I was trying to start a family, it was my future wife that made the final decision, and if anything, staying at the company might help me root out the person who tried to have me killed. But I never did figure out who it was. None of the other candidates, including those in the final pool, displayed any observably strange or erratic behaviors in the immediate aftermath, leading some to theorize that the person who hired my potential killer was someone from outside the company who was intent on doing it harm. Now, this remains the most haunting mystery of my entire life, but not purely because I came so close to a violent death. It's because it serves as a reminder that man can do everything right, keep himself spiritually and morally pure, and he can still attract the kind of evil that's been spoken about since man first learned to speak. Hello, Joel. You can call me H. I grew up in London, and when I was a kid, I had a massive interest in computers. Now, my parents did all right for themselves career-wise, meaning that they had enough money to buy a PC when they still ran on Windows 95. And I used to go crazy on MS Paint or play the video games on the floppy disks my dad had brought home from work. And to me, that computer was nothing short of magic. And then as I got older, I got more and more interested in how they worked. And then in the year 2000, Dad signed us up for a Telewest dial-up internet connection, and that changed everything. I became a full-on computer nerd, and possibly at the perfect time to do so. The country was in the final stages of its IT revolution, and a degree in almost anything IT-related meant a ticket to the gravy train. Companies all over the country were practically letting IT graduates name their salaries. Because if you could run their networks and servers and allow them access to e-commerce, you'd make them hundreds of times whatever they spent on you. Now, I landed myself on one such job in 2008, and to say that I'd landed on my feet would be an understatement, but I earned my keep. I was very good at my job, but only because of how deeply it fascinated me, and long before 2008, I'd been reading about something which had passed from scientific theory to urban legend. You might know it as the deep web. Now, the deep web is a very different concept to the dark web, even though the two terms are kind of used interchangeably. The concept of the deep web has been around ever since the internet was invented, as in no different than the concept of public and private property. There's nothing inherently sinister about setting up some private website, but it was also inevitable that certain people would use it for illicit means, and frankly, it's amazing that it took until the late 2000s for that to finally happen. And that's when the term dark web was coined, to describe these sinister sites that traded in highly illegal merchandise and in some cases, even murder. And as you can imagine, the prospect fascinated me. And so off I went looking for them, and that's when I found the Silk Road. It was a fitting name, really, harking back to the 2nd century Pan-Asian trade route which brought spices and fine china to Europe. But this was anything but state-sanctioned. Set up by an American and launched in, I think it was 2011, the Silk Road didn't just sell drugs, it sold everything. But under that everything umbrella was a hell of a lot of drugs, guns, and other contraband like handheld hacking devices, banned media, or Asian-made sweets that were banned from US markets. Now, you could count the list of rules on one hand, and almost everything functioned on an honor-based system, which turned my idea of drug dealing on its head. I'd always just assumed it was all about low purity, stepped-up products, and ripping people off at every turn. But the Silk Road was the polar opposite. It allowed wholesalers, and in some cases even manufacturers, to market their high-purity products at rock-bottom prices, mainly because they were cutting out the oh-so-expensive middlemen, and it was making people a hell of a lot of money. I visited the Silk Road every day for about 2 weeks before my curiosity evolved into something that I know now was greed, but at the time felt like opportunity. I made decent money, and I loved my job, but I was also lacking excitement in my life, and I was still young and stupid enough to really crave it. It also constituted a whole new system for me to obsess over, and by system, I mean the method by which drugs travel from their manufacturers to their consumers. I did enough research on shipping and pricing to ensure that I had at least a cursory knowledge of what I needed to do. And so one day in early 2012, I pulled the trigger on my little plan and ordered half a kilo of heroin for what amounted to 10 grand in cryptocurrency. Silk Road actually had seller reviews and a whole other seller reliability rating, and so I was easily able to find a highly rated heroin dealer who promised to hide my product in a small appliance of some kind before shipping it over. Part of me didn't really believe it would arrive, even though I knew the site was heavily policed in terms of fake reviews and scam sellers. And so when the package arrived, delivered by Royal Mail no less, my heart was thumping as I opened it up and disassembled what turned out to be a computer monitor. Now there it was, packed tightly in clear plastic baggies, half a kilo of pure golden brown Afghan heroin, enough to land me in prison from anywhere from 12 to 16 years. And after that, I had to find a buyer. And while you might assume that that was a relatively difficult process, it was not. I went into town on a Friday night, walked up to the first beggar I saw, and then told him that I'd give him a tenner if he showed me where to buy heroin. And that was all it took. He walked me to a phone, called a phone number after I handed him some change, and then about 15 minutes later, this teenage boy rode up on his bike and this beggar bought a bag of what he called brown from him. And that's when I stepped in and told the young lad on the bike that I wanted to talk to his boss. It was dark out, but I could still see the skeptical look that he gave me. But after a little exposition, he relented and asked for my phone number and then rode off, saying that he'd pass it off to his boss. Not even 2 hours had elapsed before I got a call back and was making the half-hour walk to the dark, deserted street that I'd been told to wait on. And this is when I did something crucial and put on a ski mask. I made sure to keep myself out of sight, but that meant when a trio of what looked like hooded teenagers showed up, I almost scared the living daylights out of them when I'd stepped out to greet them. And once we'd confirmed that I was friendly, they told me to show them what I'd had, and since I had the good mind to bring a very small sample with me, I was only too willing to hand it over. They were still looking at me a bit funny since I was wearing the mask, but one of them, this poorly-looking lad who turned out to be older than the rest, dabbed a bit out onto his fist and then snorted it. I knew the product was pure, and therefore potent, but I wasn't ready for the effect it'd have on the user. It knocked him out on his feet. He couldn't talk, he couldn't keep his head raised, and he just sort of swayed on his feet while the other two boys just held back their laughter. Now they too seemed impressed with what I had, and then, after the old cliched question of, "You're not the police, are you?" they led me to the top floor of a block of flats to what you Americans would call the trap. And this is where I first met Steven. He made a really big deal out of the ski mask, aggressively at first, but then much more jovially as we got talking. He didn't like that I was wearing it, and then suddenly did like that I was wearing it. It made me a character, as he put it. There were more movie cliches when he and his boys had pat me down for a wire, and I was tempted to inform him that audio bugs were so small and reliable that I'd have one hidden in one of the buttons of my jacket, but I didn't. And after that, we got talking, and thanks to the sample, I didn't need to do much of it. The product spoke for itself thanks to the zombified junkie who had to be herded back to the flat. Steven had a lot of questions, and I tried to answer as few of them as possible. I just simply told him that I had a lucrative business opportunity, and we could both get very rich off of it. And as you can imagine, this was music to his ears. He had his own bosses he needed to keep sweet, and the best way of doing that was making more money for them. And all he had to do was work with me, agree to my terms, and I'd get him the quality product that he needed to get an edge on the competition at a price he couldn't find anywhere else. That's how things started. And while things were a little bit shaky at first in terms of handoffs and keeping my identity a secret, I soon found a rhythm. I'd meet Steven's couriers in varied but local locations, ensuring my face was covered in ways that preferably didn't attract attention. A scarf and sunglasses in the wintertime, for example, where I could just pull it up over my face nice and quickly. But whenever I met with Steven face to not face, as it were, I wore the ski mask and sunglasses and never drove over in my car. Half kilos soon became kilos, but the most I ever sold at one time was 2 kilos. The most increasing variable after that was the frequency I would obtain packages. Because while the Silk Road was somewhat reliable, it wasn't foolproof. Not all poppy harvests yield the same quality product, so profit margins varied, and occasionally a trustworthy purveyor of quality goods would simply drop off the map for a while or nuke their account entirely. Delivering the packages to Steven's couriers was also pretty nerve-wracking, and walking around with kilos of heroin on my person never got old. It was always terrifying. Always. But my God, did it make me a lot of money. I was paid in cash, bundles of it too, half of which I deposited in a very dodgy credit union run by 2 Bangladeshi blokes who took 10% for the privilege of washing my dosh, so to speak. Now the rest I spent on daily essentials, petrol, food shops, takeaways, stuff that doesn't raise any eyebrows when you pay with crisp 50-pound notes. And this went on for more than 2 years. Silk Road was shut down at one point, and its founder was arrested, but a replacement was set up in no time at all, so I was able to continue my dealings with Stephen after only the briefest of interruptions. But then came the day when I was almost caught, or at least that's what it felt like, because the package containing 2 kilos was just feet away from my front door when a police officer called at my flat to ask about a recent spate of burglaries. Now, it was still hidden away in its containers, the cavity of a rice cooker, so even if the officer came in and looked around, they wouldn't have suspected a thing. But paranoia is a hell of a drug, and that marked the first time that I began to consider giving it all up. I'd made a mind-boggling amount of money for such a small amount of overall work. Not quite £1 million, but close enough to feel like it. And once I had everything washed, I had enough to buy a house, enough to fritter away, and enough to squirrel away for the inevitable rainy days. And so I decided to quit while I was ahead. Now, I sold a few more packages to Stephen, even to put together some money to celebrate with once I'd made a clean break from the business. And then one day, I gave him a call to let him know that I was getting out. And I suppose it shows how utterly naive I still was that I thought that he'd be happy for me. We weren't friends, but we were fairly close. You can't not be if you're making so much money together. I think he wouldn't be over the moon about losing such a valuable asset, but I didn't think he'd get angry, and I certainly didn't think that he'd start threatening me. It turns out he did both. I called him, told him I was getting out, and at first, I could tell that he was nonplussed because of how quiet he went. Stephen was a talker. Probably not the most ideal trait in a drug dealer, but that was just his way. So as I explained my plan to get out, and I didn't hear so much as a or an okay, I knew that he wasn't taking it well. But things got so much worse. Stephen was not accepting my resignation, and in a strange parody of a legitimate business, insisted I work a notice period before finally departing. Now, I offered to teach him about crypto and how to use the Silk Road, but Stephen was having none of it. He told me he had no obligations to people, and that he couldn't downsize without first getting the right liquidity. Stephen would often incorrectly use business terms that he didn't understand, but his point was clear. Without me, he wouldn't make as much money, and he didn't fancy that one bit. Now, before long, Stephen was straight up threatening me. Myself, my family, my friends, anything that sprang to mind. But if there's one thing that I stayed consistent with, it was keeping my identity a secret to the point that my only identifying features were the clothes that I wore to meetings, which were outfits that I never wore anywhere else, and my voice. So unless Stephen had some piece of miracle technology which would hunt me down using the sound of my voice alone, he wouldn't know where to find me. And so with that in mind, I did what very few people have done throughout history, and I hung up on an angry gangster. I'm not going to pretend that I was Mr. Cool about it. It made for a terrifying experience, and once my nerves had settled and I could think clear and straight again, I realized that I had absolutely nothing to be afraid of. Me and Stephen didn't mix in the same circles, we didn't live in the same areas of the city, and I'd never seen him during daylight hours either, so I'm pretty sure that we even kept different sleep schedules. I wasn't worried about bumping into him or any of his other little cronies anywhere, and even if I did, all I had to do was keep my mouth shut and they wouldn't realize it was me. As far as I knew, I'd gotten away with illegally making hundreds of thousands of pounds completely scot-free. And bloody hell, did that feel good. After 6 months or so of lying low and not spending too much, in which time the Silk Road got shut down for good, I decided to make my very first luxury purchase from a Bentley dealership. It was a used Bentley, so considerably less expensive than a brand new one, but Bentley's pre-owned program is probably the best on the market, so you end up with a car that is as next to brand new as it's possible to get. I visited the dealership once or twice before, mostly just driving past to admire the display models. But once I was in the clear money-wise, I started talking to the salespeople to get an idea of pricing and availability. It took a couple of visits to nail down the model I wanted. The salesman saw a chance to flog something a bit more expensive to someone young and flashy, but I was after something a little more discreet. Those sorts of models tended not to be entered into the pre-owned system, so I had to wait about 6 weeks before one became available. But when one did, I zoomed over to the dealership and put down the deposit that secured the car as mine. It felt like a victory parade, and I was happy as a pig in crap as I sat with the salesman signing papers and swapping cheerful banter. The whole process lasted about 45 minutes, and in that time, the dealership was visited by two men who wandered around the display models and then spoke with a saleswoman. I didn't pay any attention to them. I was far too focused on feeling smug and ogling the pictures of my refurbished Bentley. And then when the final papers were signed and I was given a date to pick up the car, I shook the salesman's hand, thanked him for all his time, and then rose from my chair and headed for the showroom's exit. But as I did, I noticed one of the two men looking at me. But not just looking, staring while standing statue still about 10 feet away. Maybe it's having grown up in London, but I didn't immediately return the man's stare. I just thought, what the hell are you looking at, while trying not to provoke a confrontation. That might sound a bit extreme to some of you, but as I said, London might be one of the oldest cities in the world, but it's not the friendliest. That meant that it wasn't until I was within feet of the door that I shot the man a look, and when I did, my blood turned to ice. It was not some random toff stopping in to buy a brand new Bentley. In fact, it was the one person in the world that I didn't want it to be. It was Stephen. He was wearing a suit and tie, which is partly why he didn't grab my attention when I saw him in my peripheral vision, and he was staring at me like I'd just grown a second head. Now, I was right about to say something like, "Can I help you?" but I cut myself off and tried my very best to keep a neutral look on my face as I turned it away from him. But no sooner had I done that, he asked me, "Do I know you?" Stephen had been listening to me speak to the salesman for about 15 to 20 minutes, so I'm amazed that he hadn't had the realization earlier. But I knew what a precarious position I was in there, so I just stared back at him and simply shook my head before continuing on my way. My heart felt like it was trying to burst out of my chest by the time I was out the doors, and I had to summon every ounce of bravery I had not to sprint to my car and drive off doing 100. But as I started my engine and drove out of the dealership, I saw Stephen standing just outside the doors with his phone in his hand, quite clearly taking pictures or video as I was driving off. And as I drove, it felt like my heart was going into palpitations or I was having a panic attack or something. My vision started getting very gray around the edges, and I was taking shallower and shallower breaths. As much as I was scared I might crash my car, I knew I couldn't stop, because Stephen might just be a few cars behind me. I didn't drive home. I was going to, but then realized how stupid that was given what had just happened, and turned to drive in the opposite direction. I ended up clocking maybe 5 or 6 miles before I turned into the car park of an apartment building and turned off my engine. That was the first real chance I had to stop and think, which felt like a relief at first because at least I wasn't going to lose concentration and crash my car. But it turned out to be anything but, because stopping only allowed the crushing reality of the situation to set in. Stephen had recognized me. There was no doubt about that. Enough that he wanted a record of my number plate so he could no doubt follow up on a strongly held suspicion. And when he did, when the man who'd vowed to kill me finally found me, he'd probably do things that'd make me want to die before he eventually ended me entirely. And as I contemplated that, the hazy vision panic returned and I found myself struggling to breathe. It took a minute, but I managed to calm myself enough that I could think straight, and then as I did so, the solution came to me clear as day, but it was an unthinkable one. The first part, and possibly the easiest, was abandoning my car in that car park, and the next was calling my girlfriend to tell her that she had to go and stay with her mom. She could tell something was wrong just from the sound of my voice, and I promised I'd explain everything face to face as soon as I could. But in the meantime, she had to leave the flat that we shared as quickly as possible and never return to it. Now, it took me hours to walk home, so I had plenty of time to try and reason with her, but in the end, she did as I asked. Then, when I myself got home, I packed up all the essentials, including the bricks of cash that I kept hidden away, and then took a taxi to a friend's house and asked if I could stay with him for a few days. I ended up borrowing his car to drive over to my girlfriend's mom's place, and after sitting her down in private in an upstairs bedroom, I told her everything. She had no idea that I'd been trafficking heroin. She thought that I was repairing all the appliances that I was being sent and then returning them to their owners. My excuse for the Bentley was that I'd been saving it for since I was 16, and since I had an okay salary and was good with money, she bought the excuse without asking any questions. I had this naive idea that she'd stay with me and accept my invitation to move to another city with me, but she didn't. In fact, she broke up with me there and then and said that she never wanted to hear from me ever again. Dealing drugs was one thing, but putting us in danger was another. And if it was only a matter of time before they found me through my car's registration, then she said I needed to leave right that instant. And that was the last time me and her spoke. Then the next day, after buying my mate's car from him for an eye-watering amount of cash, I drove up north, never to return to London. It broke my heart to do it. My parents didn't understand why I was leaving, and since I couldn't bring myself to tell them the truth, I made up a lie about finding a better job in the Northwest. They don't question why I never come to visit, and I'm always insisting that they come to visit me, but I think they suspect something by now. Maybe one day I'll tell them about the stupid, arrogant mistake I made and how it was that which destroyed my relationships and forced me into exile. I ended up selling that Bentley too, by the way, and I had it delivered to Manchester, and it was somewhat of a comfort at first, but it quickly became an enduring reminder of my own greed, as well as the pure devastation that the deep web had caused. Okay, so the TLDR of this is don't F around with the deep web. So even if you don't read this whole thing, take that lesson to heart for the love of God. So I used to screw around with cryptocurrencies in a very big way actually, but I won't bore you with all the nerdy little details. Just know that I was 4 digits into it and always looking for a chance to grow my pot. And so one of the major places for crypto dudes to congregate was the deep web. And this is mostly because they believe the surface web was heavily monitored, which I guess it is, obviously. But it's here that I was introduced to someone named Andre by a mutual friend. Andre said that he ran a crypto investment fund out of Belarus, and that if I made an investment, I could get double, maybe even triple the returns in just a matter of months. Now, the friend who introduced us said that Andre was legit, and so after a few weeks of talking back and forth to see if I could trust the guy, I transferred him the same amount in Bitcoin that my buddy did and then waited to see what he could do with it. Well, as it turned out, Andre could do a lot with it. And week after week, he showed me how the amount in my little pot was growing, and at first it started off slow, but as time went on, that relatively small number got bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually it got to the point where I didn't want to risk losing such a large amount of crypto. It wasn't exactly some life-changing amount, but withdrawing then meant that I had literally 10 times more money than when I first started. But when I reached out to Andre and asked him how I would go about doing that, he made it very clear that it'd be a very foolish thing to back out then. And he told me not to lose my nerve, and that within a few months my pot could be worth tens of thousands of dollars instead of just a few thousand. I wanted more money, that goes without saying, but at the same time, I knew the longer that he was out there, the bigger the risk of losing it. And so I told Andre that, respectfully, that I'd like to withdraw what I'd earned. Now, he couldn't exactly stop me, but he was incredibly insistent. Not quite to the point of intimidation, but that was just around the corner, it seems. He didn't actually turn on me until I tried to withdraw the amount, at which point I only got back the amount that I initially invested, even though my wallet with Andre now said 0. And that's when I realized that the whole thing was a scam, and how whatever was going on, I certainly wasn't making any money from it personally. Now, I tried complaining to my friend about it, the one who'd put me in touch with Andre, but then he turned on me too. I tried warning him that Andre wasn't what he'd seemed, but my friend wouldn't listen. He told me that I made a big mistake in withdrawing my crypto because I'd put the whole system in jeopardy for everyone else. Now, it still wasn't too late to reinvest, in which case there'd be no harm, no foul, but not doing so would leave everyone hanging dry, himself included. And that's when I realized that my friend, emphasis on the quotation marks there, must have been in on it, because nothing I said to him seemed to make a single bit of difference. All that mattered to him was getting me to reinvest by any means necessary, including threats. He told me Andre and his friends were not people I wanted to mess with, but since I was pretty adept at online security, I didn't think that they'd be able to find me. Now, I think on their own that they wouldn't be able to, but since I strongly suspect it was my so-called friend who betrayed my IP address to them, it was easy. Now, it started when they did something to my computer, something that made it freeze up before an Internet Explorer window opened and some kind of program downloaded and installed itself as I'm screaming no, 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 no over and over. Now, I tried saving my PC by pulling all the wires out of the back, and I even double-checked that my VPN had been properly functioning at the time of the attack. I thought I'd disconnected it just in time, but just a few days later, weird things started happening around my apartment building. I first noticed when I came home that the window nearest my fire escape was open. It didn't look like anyone had been inside my apartment, but I very clearly remember closing the window before I left my apartment that morning. And that was enough to have me looking for someplace else to stay, at least until things blew over. But literally the same night that I went and backed up all my essentials, someone stole my car and I woke up to a note in my mailbox that just said, "Reinvest." Now, I went to stay with my mom that very same day, and over the next couple of days I reported my car stolen and canceled the month-to-month lease on my apartment. It was devastating, because I had to basically trash all my devices on the assumption that they were compromised, and it took me years before I was able to fully replace everything. But that wasn't the worst of it. On the day my lease ended, I returned to my apartment to pick up the rest of my things. But when I did, something was waiting for me. I was walking towards my mom's car with a bag of clothes under each arm when a car started to turn down the lot and speeded towards me as it passed. It ended up crashing into the car that I took cover behind, and as it drove off, my mom started to freak the hell out of having to almost watch her boy get smushed. Only then did I come clean on what had happened to me, and you can call me a mama's boy if you want, but seeing her go full bear mama after I had told her was kinda cool. And she sent me to live with my uncle out of state for a while, and she got my dad to teach her how to shoot his gun just in case someone came around in my dad's house looking for me. She made a difficult time a lot easier, and she even offered me a few $100s to get myself a new laptop and a new phone. And I paid her back once I got access to my crypto and cashed it out, but I really, really appreciated what she and my uncle did for me at a time when I honestly thought that I might end up getting murdered over some damn crypto scheme. I don't even know how it all worked either. Like, I think Andre was using our money to make it look like he had this big investment network, which attracted people in the same way a Ponzi scheme does, but I don't know for certain. All I know is that whoever he was, he must have been working with some serious people if they were able to hunt me down and willingly do me harm. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of this YouTube channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul that you should totally check out and subscribe to. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, that's all the time we have today, folks. Why I oughta.